very much, Mr. Deputy Speaker. Mr. Deputy Speaker, when we discussed Yemen in this House last week, we did so in the hope that the 72-hour ceasefire negotiated by the UN's envoy to Yemen, Ismail Ahmed, could lead to a lasting cessation of hostilities from all sides and desperately needed access for humanitarian aid. These hopes, unfortunately, were immediately and regardless of who was first responsible for breaking that ceasefire, it was the ordinary civilians of Yemen who were going to pay the price. And it is distressing to learn that on top of all the other threats they face, from airstrikes, cluster bombs, acute malnutrition and the risk of famine, the Yemeni population now face an epidemic of cholera. And I believe, Mr. Speaker, wherever anyone in this House stands on the justification for this conflict, on the UN mandate for the Saudi-led military action, on the threat to regional stability caused by the Houthi uprising, we face a situation where the lives of tens of thousands of children, if not hundreds of thousands, are directly at risk if this conflict carries on in its present form, and none of us can tolerate that.
Would my honourable friend give way?
Yes, I will.
I'm most grateful to my honourable friend. She is right that the ceasefire was critical. The efforts of the Foreign Secretary John Kerry, the Saudi Foreign Minister, as well as the Special Envoy, was absolutely vital to ensuring we had that ceasefire. Does she agree with me that the involvement of the British government and the American government is crucial to ensure that we get a permanent ceasefire?
I applaud the honourable gentleman's commitment to this issue. I know that he was born in Yemen and I know that he feels this issue very strongly. And of course his approach is absolutely right. The British and the Americans have a very important influence on this, but most important of all is that we support the efforts of the United Nations. So let me make a little progress and then I will make way. So let me make clear that this debate and today's motion are not about the causes of the conflict and whether it is justified. Today's debate is about the grave concerns which many of us on all sides share about the way the conflict is being conducted and whether those concerns are being taken seriously. I will, of course, give way.
I'm very grateful to my honourable friend for giving way. It was just she was moving on from precisely the point I wanted to ask her about. But she said in her comments there that whatever one thought about the origins of the conflict, we couldn't debate how terrible the situation is for Yemenis on the ground. I agree with her entirely about that. But is there any debate about where the conflict, the origins of the conflict, or the UN Security Council resolution? I thought we pretty much were agreed across the House that the UN Security Council resolution was something we should be supporting.
Of course, no one at this stage is saying that the UN resolution is not one that we should not be supporting. However, there is further action that needs to be taken in relation to the UN conflict. For example, there has been a suggestion that the UN resolution on the 30th of September has already mandated UN experts to work alongside the jihad, if that's what the honourable gentleman is referring to. The difficulty is, if one looks at the history of this, in August, the Office of the UN Commissioner on Human Rights, and I quote, stated, he called on the international community to establish an international independent body to carry out comprehensive investigations in Yemen, which is exactly what we're calling for today. When the compromise resolution that's referred to was agreed on the 30th of September, the Commissioner's office said that they were disappointed at the outcome and said, and again I quote, "We did not have any say in the final text." So if that resolution wasn't what the Commissioner's office wanted, I don't think that we should be satisfied with it either. If the British... Yes, I will.
I'm not sure whether the Honourable Lady has received, like I think many members of Parliament, a letter today from the Deputy Speaker of the Yemeni Parliament, when he says that the demands for an independent UN investigation goes contrary to the United Nations Human Rights Council's decision in September of this year, which called for the United Nations to support instead the Yemeni National Commission investigating into civilian casualties in the conflict. Would you like to comment on that?
Yes, I will. I've seen the letter myself. I think that the important thing is that we condemn any breaches on both sides. I think that it's important to note that the United Nations has stated that 60% of civilian deaths have been as a result of actions by the coalition. And I think that it is important in this debate that we examine what it is that we are doing. So if I might move on, and I appreciate there are many people who wish to speak in this debate. I've taken 3 interventions, and if I may make some progress first. And considering all those grave concerns and dire consequences, it is about whether Britain should continue to support the Saudi forces leading one side of that conflict. My friend, the Shadow Secretary of State for International Development, will later address the humanitarian consequences in detail. I want to focus on concerns about the way the conflict is being conducted and whether those concerns are being taken seriously by the government or investigated properly. Mr. Speaker, last week I said that there have been thousands of airstrikes on civilian targets in Yemen. In response, the Under-Secretary of State said that there are not thousands, and that is to mislead the House. So let us look at the facts. In August, the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights published his office's report on the conflict in Yemen. It said that between the 1st of July 2015 and the 1st of July 2016, 2,067 civilians have been killed in that conflict. And based on the careful investigation of each incident, it said 60% of those deaths, as I've said, were caused by Saudi airstrikes. The report concluded, and this is important, in several of the documented attacks, we were unable to identify the presence of possible military objectives. In September, the independent Yemen Data Project went further. They examined more than 8,600 airstrikes conducted between the start of the conflict and the end of August 2016. And they found that 3,158 of these struck civilian sites, while a further 1,882 struck sites of undetermined use. And that is all. If I might continue, because I must make some progress, and I appreciate there are many people who wish to speak. I will give way later, but I'm not giving way at the moment. And that is, if I might, Mr. Speaker, just catch up with myself. So while a further 1,882 struck sites of undetermined use, and that is all before the recent devastating strikes on the wedding party and the funeral hall. So when I say that there have been thousands of airstrikes against civilian targets and thousands of civilians killed, I'm certainly not misleading the House, as the Minister stated, and I would respectfully suggest that perhaps someone is misleading him. And in terms of how the conflict is being conducted, Mr. Speaker, there is evidence of a further disturbing trend. I will, of course, give way to the Chair.
Well, I'm extremely grateful to the Honourable Lady. I hope she's aware of the Yemen Data Project, which has looked at those numbers and does make the point that those identification of whether those were civilian targets or not identified what their original use was, and there was no further assessment made of the use of the time of the airstrike or the circumstances that led to the airstrike. So we've got to try and be very careful here with the use of data.
I respectfully agree, and I think that, in fact, the very good point that the Right Honourable Gentleman makes, in fact, supports the argument that we're putting forward today, which is about the need for an independent investigation so that we can establish what the facts are, rather than go on assumptions and presumptions that we make. And that is why we must all be satisfied that whatever investigation is made in a way which is independent and is internationally recognised. So, I was going on to say, according to Yemen expert and LSE professor Martha Mundy, detailed examination of government agricultural statistics, she looked and saw that there were hundreds of cases where farms, livestock, water, infrastructure, food stores and markets have been targeted by Saudi airstrikes. And her analysis is that the extent of the bombing in rural areas where there is little activity besides farming shows clear evidence that Yemen's agricultural sector is being deliberately targeted. Some members today will doubtless argue that what was effectively a blockade imposed on Yemen in 2015 has helped to exacerbate the starvation crisis we are seeing today. But Saudi Arabia did at least claim some UN mandate for that action. However, there is no UN mandate for the destruction of Yemen's agricultural sector, something which, if it is deliberate and targeted, represents a clear breach of the Geneva Convention. And that brings me, Mr. Speaker, to the question of how alleged violations of international humanitarian law in Yemen are being investigated. In September, the House discussed how the government's position has changed from saying that it had assessed that there were no violations of international humanitarian law to changing it to saying that it had made no such assessment, and that it was instead for the Saudi-led coalition to investigate any such incidents. Yes, I will.
The Saudi Foreign Minister was reported very recently saying that although they do not play a role in choosing the target, United Kingdom military officials in Saudi Arabia do have access to the list of those targets. And if that's true, does she agree with me and share my bewilderment that how this government then claimed not to have reached a conclusion on those very serious breaches of international humanitarian law that have taken place in Yemen?
I do apologise to the honourable gentleman. I only heard half his point because there's a certain amount of noise coming from behind me, and perhaps I will take another intervention from him.
That's so gracious of you to do that, Shadow Secretary of State. I really welcome that this subject has been raised in the House today, and I agree with her calls for an independent investigation into this matter. Can she explain to me, though, why she feels that actually withdrawing the UK support to the coalition, which is precisely focused on training Saudis to better able to be in compliance with international humanitarian law. Therefore, our interventions, if they are effective, will create fewer civilian casualties. Why she has insisted, despite a number of us asking, in keeping that in the motion, making it very hard for many of us to vote for it.
I take on board what the honourable gentleman says, and I've considered that in advance of this. And I read something that had been stated by a Californian congressman called Ted Lieu, and he said this: when it's repeated airstrikes that have now killed children, doctors, newlyweds, patients, at some point you have to say either Saudi Arabia is not listening to the United States or they just don't care. And I fear that the same may be true for the advice that we might be given. There was a spokesperson for the Pentagon who said, even as we assist the Saudis regarding their territorial integrity, it does not mean that we will refrain from expressing our concern about the war in Yemen and how it has been waged. I will go into my speech at a later stage about how it is that I believe there may be a particular reason why, although I hear what the honourable gentleman says about advice that may be given in relation to some of the targeting, there may not be advice in relation to all of it. And if you will have some patience, he will get an answer to part of his question. So if I might pick up. So my concern is that they are therefore putting their faith entirely in the Saudis' Joint Incidents Assessment Team, the JIAD, to give us the truth on these alleged violations. I showed earlier that there have been thousands of documented airstrikes on civilian sites and thousands of civilians killed as a result. So we would expect the JIAD, at the very least, to have published reports on hundreds of these incidents. But how many has it actually published? 9. Just 9, Mr. Deputy Speaker. That is less than 0.002% of all airstrikes documented by the Yemen Data Project up to the end of August. And how credible are those reports? The UN protests that 4 World Food Programme trucks have been attacked. The JIAD blames the officials in charge of the convoy. The UN protests that 73 civilians were killed and injured in a market in Sinai. The JIAD says that there have been no direct attacks on civilians and no fault on the part of the coalition forces. The UN protests that another 106 civilians were killed in a market in Haifa. The JIAD disputes this and says that disputes that there were civilians and finds no proof of fault. The UN protests that 47 civilians were killed and 58 injured in a wedding in Daimar, and the JIAD says that there was no such bombing that took place. In only 2 of the 9 incidents it is reported on, and the thousands more that it is not, has the JIAD accepted that there was any fault on behalf of the Saudi-led coalition. One for the bombing on a residential complex in July 2050, and one for the airstrike on the funeral hall in Sinai this month.
Will she give way?
Yes, I will.
I thank the Honourable Lady for giving way. Does she share my disappointment as well that despite the frank admissions over the funeral bombing, the Saudi government, when we have met with representatives, has still refused to even give a timetable for giving information on these investigations, let alone answers that might be satisfactory? Does she not agree with me they absolutely must come forward as soon as possible and that there should be an independent investigation?
That I was at the same meeting with the honourable gentleman, and I heard the Saudi Foreign Minister telling us that he was not able to give us a timetable when it came to the investigation, and I share his grave concern about this. Because when asked at the weekend about the late Latter incident, the Under Secretary of State, the member for Bournemouth East, called it, and I quote, a deliberate error, by which I believe he meant at least one individual within the coalition forces was able to deliberately unleash this terrible attack, killing 140 civilians without the authorization of the coalition command in Riyadh. This raises major questions. Members on all sides will have spoken to experts on the conflict who say that there are essentially two coalition forces operating in Yemen. One run from the capital, which carries out pre-planned operations based on strong intelligence under the direction of the Americans and UK advisors, and the other, and this answers the point that the honourable gentleman was raising, there is another centre operating out of southern Saudi Arabia, which carries out dynamic, reactive operations, often on the basis of sketchy evidence, often without thinking through the so-called collateral damage, and inevitably, often with significant civilian casualties. And of course, if this is the case, that any coalition forces are acting in a reckless or indiscriminate manner when it comes to airstrikes in civilian areas, that would itself be a clear violation of international humanitarian law and should cause this whole House grave concern. But the Under Secretary of State's explanation of the Sana'a funeral bombing, that it was a deliberate error, raises the prospect that there has also been intentional targeting of civilians by elements of the coalition forces that he cannot tell us, and he cannot tell us because he does not know how many of those thousands of airstrikes against civilian targets have also been deliberate errors. That brings me, Mr. Speaker, to the crucial point of today's motion, the need for a full, independent, UN-led investigation into all alleged violations of international humanitarian law in Yemen. An investigation into all the thousands of attacks on civilian sites, not just 9, and into all the thousands of civilian deaths, not just a few hundred. We need to know whether Yemen's agricultural sector has been deliberately targeted in breach of international humanitarian law. We need to know whether elements of the coalition air forces are routinely operating in a reckless and indiscriminate way. We need to know whether this deliberate error in Sana'a was a one-off or part of a more systemic problem. And finally, from the UK perspective, Mr. Speaker, if there have been violations of international humanitarian law, we need to know whether UK manufactured weapons and planes have been used to commit them. With all due respect to the individuals who make up Saudi's Jayat, their output to date, whether in terms of volume, speed or content, give no confidence that they can carry out this type of comprehensive, let alone independent investigation.
My honourable friend,
yes.
I'm grateful to my honourable friend for giving way, and I absolutely agree with the argument that she's making. In making the case for an independent UN-led investigation, can she make it clear that that would investigate both sides and alleged violations committed by both sides in this conflict?
Absolutely, and the honourable gentleman is quite right. There have been violations on both sides, and I stated that at the outset of my speech, and it is an important fact to make absolutely clear before the House. But it is also important for us to make clear that where we are operating, we are giving support to one side, it is important that we hold that up, in particular, to the light of day. Yes, of course, I'll give it.
I think she's made the case very well for an independent investigation. But given all that we know and what she's outlined, wouldn't it be right to suspend arms supplies to Saudi Arabia while that independent investigation takes place?
I fully understand the honourable gentleman's point, but can I turn the question round? Because at present we are unclear, and perhaps the government can tell us definitively, whether weapons and planes sold to Saudi Arabia today will be used in Yemen tomorrow. Because until we have an answer to that, it is not possible for us to say at this stage what type of support we would be giving to the coalition. Because does that include the sale of arms that are being used in Yemen next month? If I might move on, Mr. Speaker, it is manifestly clear that we need a UN-led investigation. It is equally clear to me, and I hope to members on all sides of this House, that until that investigation is concluded, it is right for the UK to suspend its active support of the coalition forces. It is partly a matter of our own moral protection. But also, we should not be actively continuing to support those forces while their conduct of war is under investigation. It is partly about the pressure such a decision will place on the coalition forces. I will give way in a moment, if I can just finish the sentence. It is partly about the pressure such a decision will place on the coalition forces to avoid further civilian casualties, to engage constructively in peace talks, and to allow full access for humanitarian relief.
The Chair of Foreign Secretary for giving way. Can she explain to the thousands of people across this country who are supporting our allies in the region what her proposal means? Does it mean, for example, that she is in favour of suspending all spares to those aircraft operated by the UAE, Saudi and other members of the coalition? Does it mean that she wishes to withdraw the support that is given, the advice that is given by skilled British employees helping our Saudi friends? Is that what she means? Because if that is what she means, she is doing great damage to the British national interest.
Again, I think that is an important point that the honourable gentleman raises. The question is given the impact on our economy, is it right at this stage for us to be suspending support for Saudi? Is it right, given the amount of arms that we sell and the amount of planes that we sell, is it right for us to suspend arms sales to Saudi, if that is part of the support that we're currently giving to the coalition? I would ask this. We have always, when selling arms to our allies, have always complied with international humanitarian law. And the question simply is this. We have regulations around this. We have regulations as to who we sell arms to and in what circumstances. As the Foreign Secretary has said himself, the test for continued arms sales is whether those weapons might be used in the commission of a serious breach of international humanitarian law. We have rules in relation to arms exports, and we have to make sure that we abide by them. We are a proud country that do our utmost to abide by international law, and the questions that we are raising today are very important ones, because if our support for the coalition means that we are supporting a coalition whose actions are in contravention of international law, then we must look again at that support. That is the right position for us to take. If I might, Mr. Speaker, move on, because
I'm grateful. I'm grateful to the Honourable Lady for giving way. My dyslexia strikes. I urge the Honourable Lady to just think for a moment about the impact such a suspension would have on our credibility as an ally in this dangerous and fractured part of the world. There's a very great difference between saying civilians have been killed because perhaps terrorists are sheltering around what were civilian faculties, and actually alleging that there's a deliberate programme of mass slaughter. It's worth remembering that when we've been doing a lot of historical commemoration, the huge number of French civilians that we killed in the building.
Order. I have a lot of sympathy for interventions, but in the end, there's a lot of members, there's 26 members who wish to speak in this. We're not going to get there. It could be 3 minutes at the moment. So please, short interventions. Emily Fong.
If I might just refer the honourable gentleman to part of my speech earlier where I quoted one of his own ministers who said that there had been a deliberate error and that had resulted in hundreds of deaths in Yemen. I do think that he needs to bear this in mind when we are deciding whether or not we should be continuing to support the action going on in Yemen at the moment. And I do think this is important. And if I may, the rest of my speech I will answer the rest of his question. Because, Mr. Speaker, it's finally about what kind of signal we are sending to the rest of the world. When it comes to Syria, members on all sides have rightly protested the bombardment of eastern Aleppo by Russia and Assad, demanded tougher international action against Russia, dismissed the Russian claims that civilians are not being targeted, and called for those responsible to be held up for war crimes if they are responsible for war crimes. They must face justice. We have heard all these things, and very strongly too, from the Foreign Secretary. No, I'm not giving way anymore. There are 26 people needing to speak. We have heard all these things, and very strongly too, from the Shadow Foreign Secretary. So does he accept, when he says nothing on Yemen, but unflinching support for Saudi Arabia, when he says that the Saudi coalition should be left to investigate themselves, when his ministers dismiss reports that thousands of civilians have been killed as somehow misleading the House, when we say one thing about Russia and Aleppo, but we say another about Riyadh and Yemen, what the rest of the world hears is hypocrisy and double standards. But, Mr. Speaker, today's motion gives us an opportunity to send the opposite message to the world, to show how we hold all countries, friend or foe, to the same high standards that we aspire to ourselves, and that while Saudi Arabia will remain a valued strategic security and economic ally, our support for their forces in Yemen must be suspended until the alleged violations of international humanitarian law in that conflict have been fully and independently investigated, and until the children of Yemen have received the humanitarian aid that they so desperately need. That is the right message to send to the rest of the world, and that is the message which reflects who we are as a country. And I hope that this is the message that this House will vote to send today.
The question is on the order paper. I now call the Foreign Secretary to move the amendment. Boris Johnson.
Mr. Deputy Speaker, I'm grateful to the opposition for selecting this vital subject for debate, and I rise to support the amendment in my name and that of the Prime Minister. The war in Yemen has reached a critical moment, and I welcome this opportunity to set out what Britain and our allies are doing to help restore the peace and stability that Yemen's people so desperately need. But first, I should remind the House how this tragic conflict began, and in particular, how Saudi Arabia and a coalition of Gulf states came to intervene. Because, contrary to the impression given in some quarters, they did not act out of some spontaneous desire to invade Yemen and attack its civilian population. Saudi Arabia and its allies were responding to a crisis that was forced upon them and that posed a grave threat to international peace and security. This round of the conflict began in September 2014 when Houthi rebels overran Yemen's capital, Sana'a, in collusion with Ali Abdullah Saleh, the previous president, and with reported backing of Iran. Their aim was to overthrow Yemen's legitimate government. In January 2015, President Hadi, the serving leader, was forced to flee his own capital for the safety of Yemen, a move which availed him nothing because 2 months later the Houthis attacked the south, striking as far as the outskirts of Aden, forcing President Hadi to flee his country altogether. At that moment, with pleasure.
Is the Foreign Secretary aware that President Saleh, ex-President Saleh, has also been asking for backing from the Russians as well?
The situation in Yemen is potentially disastrous, and it is absolutely vital that we stand by the people of Yemen and by the coalition that is trying to sort it out. Because the position when President Hadi was forced to flee was potentially disastrous. Yemen is a country of 26 million people, more than half of them under the age of 18, with a long-standing presence of Al-Qaeda in that country, history of fratricidal bloodshed and of chronic instability. And at that moment, there was a clear risk that the country would fall into the hands of forces avowedly hostile to Saudi Arabia, of course, a country that shares an 800-mile border with Saudi Arabia, a border that is vulnerable and porous. And it was against that background that the Saudis and their allies took a decision to intervene in Yemen in March 2015, a decision that was not only justified but legally sound. I'll give way in a moment. President Hadi had formally requested legal action to restore his government, while the Arab League and Gulf Cooperation Council both called for, and I quote, all means and measures to protect Yemen and deter Houthi aggression. And their fears have been plainly borne out. Mortar bombs and rockets have frequently been fired over the frontier and into Saudi territory. Only 2 weeks ago, the Houthis launched a Scud missile which flew 300 miles into Saudi Arabia, exploding outside Taif, a city the size of Birmingham.